Hello, learners, and welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. Today, I will begin introducing the historical, cultural, social, and economic contexts for a very important text in the history of Victorian literature, a text that we will spend some time discussing in greater detail. The title of this text is Aurora Leigh. It is a Bildungsroman, but more specifically, it is a Künstlerroman. It is a fictional account of the development of an artist. It is unique because it is one of the epic verse novels that was published in the Victorian era. Additionally, it is also unique because it describes the development of a woman artist. This book was published in the year 1854, and in order to understand the context from which this writing emerged, we will spend some time and study the historical events and forces that were at play in the decade preceding this year. So, since this novel was published in the year 1854, we will spend some time trying to understand what was happening in England in the 1840s. The key things that we need to understand to get a sense of what was happening in this time is that there was a working class movement which developed in England. It was inspired by political changes in 19th century Europe, but the trajectory of this working class movement in England was very different from the trajectory that the working class movement had taken in Europe. We'll try and understand that, why it took the different trajectory that it did, why there was no revolutionary change in England as there was in Europe, and finally, what signified this moment of prosperity. So, the 1840s began as a time of great economic inequality. At least they were perceived as a time of great economic inequality. But towards the end of the decade, the perception changed from inequality and precariousness to a great deal of prosperity. The prosperity was symbolized by an event which is very famous, and it is also very well known to most students of Victorian literature. It is the Great Exhibition, which was held in the year 1851. So essentially, this is the economic and social history that we will first track in order to understand what were the tendencies and forces under play in the times preceding the publication and the writing of Aurora Leigh. The 1840s in Europe were a time of great change. The nature of this change was violent, revolutionary, and political. A sense of that change, a sense of the reality of violent change in Europe is captured to a very great deal in the poem Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, which was written and published in the year 1851. Arnold ends Dover Beach with these words: "The world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." Now, here Arnold refers to a great deal of conflict, but there's also a sense that the conflict emerges out of ignorance and does not lead to any resolution or certitude. That is why the speaker of the poem says, "Nor certitude nor peace, neither joy nor love nor light." And these armies who clash by night are described as ignorant. What were these ignorant armies, and why does Matthew Arnold feel that this conflict emerges from a place of confusion and does not lead to any sort of resolution either? To get a sense of what Matthew Arnold might have been thinking of when he wrote these words, we can think about what took place in Europe in the 2 or 3 years before this poem was composed. A very, very brief and not exhaustive and merely indicative summary of major historical turning points in this time and place can be summed up thus. In the autumn of 1848, there were revolutions in Sicily, Paris, Germany, and Italy. In the year 1849, wars began or continued between Sardinia and Austria, France and Italy, and Austria and Hungary. So these ignorant armies clashing by night that Arnold was referring to. And immediately after Arnold completes Dover Beach, further conflict emerges. So we can now understand how prescient and almost prophetic Arnold's words were when Arnold writes that there was no certitude, nor peace, nor plea for help. That even though the war seems to emerge from a conflict, and one might hope that these conflicts will be resolved through a kind of aggressive or hostile fighting, the end of this one phase of fighting or war does not yield a resolution or peace, but instead leads to further conflict and fight. And that's exactly what one witnessed in the geopolitical space of Europe in the year 1854, when Britain and France declared war on Russia, thus beginning the Crimean War. So you can see how the 1840s as well as the early 1850s were a time of great deal of political unrest and change in Europe. And there was a perception of this tumultuous change in England. Now, whether the change transported itself to England, whether England also followed Europe in undergoing those changes, that is a different question, and we will try to answer that eventually. So, in 1840s in England, the conditions were ripe for radical revolutionary change. What were these conditions? Conditions of great economic inequality and impoverishment of the depressed or lower economic classes. The 1840s in England were also known as the Hungry 40s, literally because of how many people went hungry, how many people didn't have enough means to support themselves. And this concern, this preoccupation with economic inequality was reflected in the novels and the fiction that was published and read in the 1840s. And to just get a sense of this, we can see how this phenomena was reflected in the culture as well. Throughout the 1840s, but especially during the early economically depressed years, known as the Hungry 40s, that is, the early part of the decade was particularly severe. A great deal of insurrection was feared by the middle and upper classes, and writers often expressed their apprehensions. The condition of England question became an important one. A lot of writers, both fiction writers as well as journalists and scholars, felt the need to respond to this condition of England question. And what kind of a question it was and what kind of responses writers gave to it. These responses normally focused on the social effects of free market capitalism and on class conflict. And these responses dominated novels of the period. A few notable novels are Benjamin Disraeli's Sibyl or the Two Nations, published in the year 1845, Charles Kingsley's Yeast, published in the year 1848, and also Alton Locke, also by Charles Kingsley, published in the year 1850, and Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton, published in the year 1848. Now, coming to the work of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, we find that she wrote a poem titled The Cry of the Human in the year 1842, which responded to these times of scarcity, economic inequality, and material impoverishment that a lot of writers witnessed in the society of England all around them. In The Cry of the Human, this poem, published in the year 1842, Elizabeth Barrett Browning writes about the plague of gold that strikes far and near, and how this plague of gold and its consequences affect the human heart. Browning writes, "Our thoughts grow blank, our words grow strange. We cheer the pale gold diggers. Each soul is worth so much on change, and marked like sheep with figures." So we can see how in the early part of this decade, there's a sense of the commodification of human life and human existence. The reference to the pale gold diggers is reference to the discovery of reserves of gold under the ground, which was being found all over the world, and especially in many British colonies, such as the coast of Australia. There's also a reference here to how some people in England cheer the gold diggers, right? So, because they know that the extraction and the discovery of gold will be beneficial to society life in England. Further, the writer of these words also laments how each soul is worth so much on change, meaning the value of an individual life is determined by what can be had in exchange for that life. Right? So this is a reference to the rise of exchange value and how a lot of transactional ways of thinking were becoming popular in the 19th century. This sort of concern was also reflected in the non-fictional, journalistic, and scholarly writing of the 19th century. And we will now reflect on two works of prose, non-fictional prose, which addressed this situation in their own way. In literature as well as scholarship and non-fictional writing, a great deal of reflection on the economic inequality that was unleashed in England was found. Perhaps the most excruciating chronicles of working class life emerged in Friedrich Engels' book, The Condition of the Working Classes in England. This work was first published in Germany in the year 1845. Another work which did similar intellectual labor but was also different in the polemical stand that it took was Henry Mayhew's book, London Labour and the London Poor, which was serialized from 1851 to 1852. What were these writers doing? Let us try and understand by focusing first on Friedrich Engels' The Condition of the Working Classes in England. Friedrich Engels was probably the earliest major study of the effects of industrialization on workers. He talked about the occupational diseases that afflicted them. He also discussed the inadequacy of their diets, their clothing, their medical care and education or lack thereof, as well as the dangers of working in mines, mills, and factories, their victimization by the cycles of the marketplace, and finally, the horrors of their living conditions. So, a holistic, full-fledged, multifaceted ethnography of the conditions of the working classes in England, exactly as the title promised. The book delved into each and every aspect of these conditions. Engels focuses on the area of England in northeastern Manchester, where Engels describes the coal-black, stagnant, stinking Medlock River, which divided two disgusting neighborhoods. And these are Engels' words, which I'm quoting. Neighborhoods of 4,000 people inhabiting 400 dilapidated one-room cottages. These surrounded by heaps of refuse, offal, and sickening filth. Engels describes a neighborhood polluted by stench and thick factory smoke, an area where hordes of ragged women and children swarm about the streets just as dirty as the pigs which wallow nearby. Engels concludes that this population has, and I quote, sunk to the lowest level of humanity, unquote, imaginable, and suggests that its members would have little to lose in an uprising against their oppressors. So you see this suggestion that these workers are already living in such wretched conditions that they would see some incentive in political or violent revolution. Why? What is the incentive? The incentive is that nothing could probably get worse. Their lives are already in such a horrid state that a revolution can only make things better. Change can only mean a positive improvement. Henry Mayhew also describes the similarly wretched conditions of workers, but unlike Engels, Mayhew does not provide a polemical solution or way forward. Mayhew lays before the reader a catalogue of such occupations in London as yield a bare subsistence to the parties engaged in them, along with descriptions of the dwellings of the unrelieved poor, and in the process exposes, quote, not only on how little they subsist, but also the rent they are charged for their waterless, drainless, floorless, and almost roofless tenements, and calculate the interest that the petty capitalist reaps from their necessities. So you can see that Mayhew's is a very economic approach in the sense that he provides a great deal of numbers and a great deal of calculations with the goal of communicating to the average Victorian reader how inhuman were the conditions in which many of the workers, that is, human beings of their own society, lived in highly inhuman conditions. Now, it might be natural to conclude from these descriptions that the readers and the people who are described in these works would see some reason to rebel, some reason to rise up, to take up arms and challenge the administration which had created or allowed such conditions to subsist in which such exploitation and inhumanity was unfolding. However, even there were some localized incidents of violence during the 1840s. These deplorable conditions of the working classes in England did not lead to any large-scale revolutionary movement. And this is a somewhat extraordinary historical fact. And instead of a revolutionary change, instead of a violent uprising, what we get at the end of this decade of the Hungry 40s is instead a celebration of wealth, a celebration of prosperity, a celebration of a great deal of well-being, economic stability and well-being. And what is that celebration? It was emblemized in the 1851 exhibition, which was held in May of that year, of the dazzling Crystal Palace, right? And it was in this structure, the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, that the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations, that was the full and official title of the great exhibition, was held. Why was this? And how have Victorian scholars, historians, and contemporary historians and scholars, how have scholars tried to make sense of this somewhat surprising turn of events? We can begin by reading one somewhat conservative account. This is the historian G.M. Young. Young writes, "The storm which swept away half the governments of Europe passed harmlessly over the islands, and the words which Macaulay wrote at the beginning of his History of England, that his checkered narrative would excite thankfulness in all religious minds and hope in the breast of all patriots, had a deep significance for his first readers. Watching the nations of Europe sink one by one from the convulsive anarchy back into despotism, and seeing in the recovered unity, as much as in the prosperity of England, a triumphant vindication of the historic English way." What is this historic English way? Now, at the private level, in the private space, the historic English way designated the stiff upper lip and muddling through. It referred to emotional and personal traits of perseverance or stamina. At the public level, however, the historic English way referred to constitutional monarchy. As I mentioned in my first two lectures, there was a great deal of political reform being enacted in the 1830s. The reform was guided by the political thought of Jeremy Bentham, who argued that the divine right of kingship, which was a somewhat feudal and autocratic and theocratic idea, must be replaced by a more logical, scientific right to rule that is based on the voting and democratic processes. This process had been unfolding a decade before, and so in the 1840s, even though there was a lot of cause for unrest, it was also possible to see that the administration was making efforts to address the concerns, the needs, and the suffering of the lower orders. Right? So well before 1848, that is 1848 is the year that a great deal of political change and revolutionary change was inaugurated in Europe. Well before this year, there was clear evidence of legislative progress in England towards the amelioration of political, social, and economic ills afflicting the lower orders. Okay? Moreover, in addition to these legislative changes, there was also a working class movement which had begun in England and which had made some progress. It had received some support, but it eventually fizzled out. And by the end of 1848, that working class movement had proven to be ineffectual. What was that movement and what did it achieve? The movement began in the year 1836 when the radical William Lovett founded the London Working Men's Association, made up largely of self educated artisans. This movement gathered more support, and in the year 1838, Lovett joined hands with Francis Place, who drew up a program for massive political reform detailed in the People's Charter, a document that was ultimately submitted as a petition for parliamentary action three times in the year 1839, 1842, and 1848. So you can see that even though there is a great deal of legislation, parallel to such legislation that seeks to replace the theocratic rule with a more logical, more scientific process of governance, there was also a working class movement. This was a movement that was led by these two individuals, that is William Lovett and Francis Place. They attracted a lot of self educated, self made artisans, that is, people who earned money by the practice of a trade that they had taught themselves, or if not they themselves, then their own community of like minded and similarly skilled traders. So it was the community of traders and self recognition of the worth and the dignity and the right of these people to decide how their lives should be governed that began to attract a lot of people. It also began to attract a lot of attention in Parliament. And the People's Charter was a program for radical, far reaching, and more democratic legislation that went beyond the 1832 Reform Bill and which sought to introduce massive political changes. And there were repeated attempts to get these changes approved by Parliament, and it was tabled multiple times in the years 1839, 1842, and 1848. This People's Charter had several key points, and I will briefly summarize these 6 points. It was based on the work of Jeremy Bentham, and it had 6 points which appeared quite radical at the time it was tabled in Parliament. They wanted universal male suffrage, they wanted equal electoral districts, they wanted the removal of property qualifications for members of Parliament, they wanted payment for MPs, they wanted a secret ballot, and they wanted annual general elections. So you can see just by the sound and the literal meaning of these demands how radical a change this People's Charter was trying to produce in England. Removal of property qualifications, meaning anyone, irrespective of how much property they owned, could become members of Parliament. Members of Parliament would receive a payment, and this follows naturally from the previous requirement, because if a member of Parliament does not own land, then they don't have an independent income from the rents of that land. Therefore, they required a payment from the state or the government's exchequer to the Member of Parliament. They also wanted a secret ballot, meaning it would ensure that people would have the freedom to choose whoever they wanted, irrespective of being pressured to vote for a certain individual or party. They also wanted universal male suffrage. Now, universal male suffrage is not that universal. There is a contradiction in terms. But in the mid-19th century, the very word universal, even though undercut by the filter male, was still quite radical, because even all men did not have the right to vote, and it was restricted to people who owned a certain amount of property. So these were the radical changes that the People's Charter wanted to implement through the passage of laws. These did not come about, and these were ultimately rejected. This was not, however, for want of trying. The Chartists established multiple bases of operation in major industrial cities, that is, London, Birmingham, and Leeds, and they organized large public meetings of working people who were addressed by quite zealous speakers. So it was a very public and strenuous agitation, even though it did not achieve the goal that it wanted to finally realize. This shows that there was a very active intellectual as well as cultural support for the ideas of socialism. And even though these ideas did not lead to revolutionary change as in Europe, they still produced significant cultural and literary change in England. And we will understand precisely what those cultural and literary changes were in the next lecture. Thank you.